who is Bhupendra Chaubey. Bhupendra Chaubey did his post-graduation in films before becoming a journalist. He was a senior journalist and later an editor at CNN News 18. Bhupendra Chaubey has been among the finest political journalists of his generation. As a political journalist, he has traveled the length and breadth of the country and has covered four general elections along with covering assembly elections for the last 15 years. Shri Bhupendra Chaubey was an executive editor of CNN IBN and used to host the primetime broadcast India at 9 before turning a consulting editor to try his hand at a new journalism platform. He now hosts a weekend interview show, Hot Seat, where he puts tough questions to key newsmakers. He is the co promoter and editor in chief of India's only audience based multimedia news platform, India Ahead, which is a platform cutting across TV, print, and digital media. Over the last 2 decades, Sri Bhupendra Chaubey has brought stories of all hues from political crisis to human tragedies in our living rooms. Please, with a big round of applause, welcome Mr. Bhupendra Chaubey. I will now introduce the moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Ratan Sharda. Dr. Ratan Sharda is a well known author, freelance columnist, and TV panelist. He has been an ERP consultant till recently. He was awarded a PhD in July 2018 for his thesis, Understanding RSS through its Resolution. He has edited 12 books, written 9 books, out of which 7 are on RSS, one on Guru Nanak Dev, and one on disaster management. His latest book is on conflict resolution, the RSS way, which we are going to launch at the end of this session. Ratan Sharda was jailed during the days of emergency between 1975 and 77 when he was the General Secretary of his College Students' Union. Ratan Sharda is also the founder member of Vishwa Adhyayan Kendra, for which he was the General Secretary for the first 8 years. He is a member of the Educational Trust under the umbrella of Keshav Srushti and an advisor to many voluntary organizations. With a big round of applause, I once again request everyone to welcome Mr. Ratan Sharda, who has been a friend, philosopher, guide to VESIM Lit Fest as well. Over to you, Ratanji.
Namaskar, Bhupendra ji. First of all, thanks for accepting the invitation without any ado in a very graceful manner. I am in a very awkward position today. I am conducting this webinar sitting in a lit fest. I am about to be inaugurated on the ground floor. I am sitting in a dressing room trying to put my laptop on a dari and also trying to conduct with a telephone hotspot. I hope the system works. And with this, I'll begin the program. Bhupendra ji, as you know, the title is India a Nation or a Federation? Recently, a very eminent young intellectual, political intellectual, has told us that India is not a nation, it's a union of states. So your comment, the initial comment.
Thanks very much, Ratanji. That makes the two of us, you and I. You are there in your basement and I'm there in Lucknow, where I had come to attend the swearing-in ceremony of Yogi Adityanath. So I'm in a hotel right now. So pardon me if my frame is not correct. But let me first wish a very good morning to all the youngsters, all the students here. Always a great pleasure speaking to Ratanji, for whom I have nothing else but greatest admiration. I've enjoyed my television conversations with him, and whenever we got a chance to exchange thoughts, one has always enjoyed chatting up with him. But to your specific question and the motion before this house today, that is India a nation or is it a confederation of states? I think that from where we started off in our journey in 1947 and where we are in 2022, I would like to argue that we may well have started off as a confederation of states. But I think in the last decade or so, we are increasingly moving towards becoming one nation. Am I saying two contradictory things, or am I saying two things which sort of supplement each other, complement each other? Is what I'd like to spend some time on tonight, today in the morning, while speaking to you and addressing this house. I think that since when we achieved our independence, you see, the world was very different. We were looking at our own lives very differently. We had a certain worldview. all the way up to, I would say, which existed till around about 2000, 2002. The era of liberalization, I think, kind of changed the way we look at ourselves, the kind of expectations one would have had out of one's own self, and therefore our own understanding of what a nation really stood for. If I was to ask myself, or if I was to ask you or anybody here, what does a nation really mean? Why do we say that a confederation of states may be different from a nation? Why do we say that these may be two different ideas? Are these two different ideas, or are these two ideas somewhere supplementing each other? Is the way I kind of look at this proposition. I think that since the advent of the Bharatiya Janata Party, there has been a greater realization in several parts of the country that there is something called the nation. Now, what is the definition of this nation? Is a nation a utopian concept? Is the nation is the definition of the word nation just an idea, and can it not be executed on the ground? I would believe that if you look at the abrogation of Article 370, I would believe that if you look at the imposition of uniform civil code now in Uttarakhand and potentially maybe in other parts of the country as well, I think we are now firmly on that trajectory where India will be looked at ultimately, inevitably, if not in the immediate run, but ultimately I do believe that India will be looked at as one nation. As one nation where there is a certain idea. Is the United States of America really the United States of America? Is India really the United States of India? Is Europe really the United States of Europe? I think why this discussion point, or this potential contradiction between India as a confederation of states and India as one nation, the reason why this sort of contradiction always stays with us is because maybe for many of us, we are unwilling to accept that we have changed. We have evolved as a society, and we have evolved as a democracy since our independence. We are not who we were. Maybe between all the way, let's say from 1947 when we achieved our independence, all the way till 2000 to 2005, we're a remarkably different nation. We're a remarkably different polity, a remarkably different democracy. I'm here right now in Lucknow, and I'd like to share with you, Ratanji, what I saw myself yesterday. I mean, over the last 20 years, I must have gone to swearing-in sessions of, I think, almost all chief ministers across the country. But what I saw yesterday, I have never seen this. I have never seen cabinet ministers. I have never seen chief ministers. Amit Shah, the home minister of the country, Pushkar Singh Dhami, chief minister of a state in India, they had to walk for kilometers to get to the venue where the swearing-in ceremony was going on. Now, the only reason why this could have happened is because there is a certain tendency, there is a certain feeling which I think people in India now have, that we have become one nation. It makes a lot of people on, let's say, on the liberal side very uncomfortable, because how can you look at a scenario where one shoe size fits all? How can you look at a scenario that there should be one, let's say, uniform civil code? How can you look at a scenario that one law fits everybody? But the reality is that people are willing to understand that maybe that is what was keeping India, away from firing on all cylinders. Are we firing on all cylinders? I'd love to get into a debate with you on that. Is our economy really performing? Are jobs really being generated? We have so many, youngsters here. And is the idea of one nation, if we were to look at ourselves as one nation, as one united nation, is that idea of one consolidated, united nation going to take care of our problems? Is a debatable subject. But I think that what is very, very clearly looking at us in our faces is that we have changed, we have evolved as a democracy, and people are seriously now beginning to understand the pros and cons of being looked at as one nation. But if anyone was to tell me that we are still a confederation of states, I refuse to believe that. You could maybe say that we are a confederation of maybe two regions, given the fact that the political realities of southern parts of the country are vastly different from what's happening in the northern parts of the country. But we are in that direction where people of India are very clearly beginning to look at us as one nation.
Bhupendra, thanks for your opening remarks. You have taken it to modern era, but if I go back a little, I would say that what you saw in UP and what you're seeing since 2014 is the reassertion of the people that we are a nation and we always were a nation. By what you say, I believe that you think that our nationhood comes from the constitution. So when you say our nationhood comes from the constitution, uh, you mean that before the era of Nehru and before 1947, we were never a nation, because the theory is also presented by the communists. The Adhikari document, which said in way back in 42, 46, that we are not a nation, but we are a confederation of 16, 17 nations, which need to be made sovereign nations. From there on, Jawaharlal Nehruji's Discovery of India, which is a wonderful book, which is the basis of Congress thinking, was that it was a nation. I don't know who invented the nation. People just walked in, they put up their shops. So there are Turks, there are Mongols, there are Aryans. Everybody came from the outside. There was no indigenous person. And it was like a sarai, roadside sarai. People would just walk in and put in the tents. That sense of a very undefined nation is what Nehruji gave an idea about. And when Constitution was made, the Constitution was derived from all the foreign sources, but no local source, no original scripture, no original thinker like Chanakya was considered fit enough to be part of that process of creating a constitution. So when you say that in 1947 we are a confederation nation, I think you are taking the definition, Nehruvian definition of a nation, which I many times say that the biggest conflict between what BJP represents and what RSS represents is that we are a perennial nation, which was a cultural entity right from thousands of years. I have shlokas here which I'll talk of later. There is Vishnu Puran, Markandeya Puran, where we are talking about it. Kalidas talks about it 6 BC. Chanakya talks about entire nation 4 BC. So for us, nation was an entity, though different kingdoms, it was one nation. But the 1947 constitution somehow gives us an impression. Yes, definitely there are princely states that are brought together. That's a huge exercise. But that doesn't make us a confederation of nation. So should we go by the constitutional definition of the nation, or we should look back at the history of our nation and say we don't believe in nation state. For us, the state is different. The nation made of people is different. We may be different people. We may have different expressions, but there is a strong underlying unity that puts us together. We may look different, we may behave differently, but ultimately when we talk of our own different perspective of civilization, we all have the same civilizational sense of the nation, of our nationhood, which is expressed differently. So would I dare say that we are sticking to the constitutional definition, and then you say because of the change in the environment, as we grow stronger, as we become confident, we have started believing yes, we are one nation. And from where does the idea of being a confederation of nation come?
Well, Ratanji, see, what you're saying is a quintessentially conventional argument which has been made on multiple occasions. Look, when we were invaded by the imperialist powers, why did we become a British colony? Did we become a British colony because we were a confederation of states, or did we become a British colony because we were a nation? We became a British colony because there were certain regions which existed in India, and certain regions had certain economic agendas which are associated with it. And the imperialist powers looked at us purely from let's say from an economic angle. The reason why I was trying to set the context from 1947 is because I look at the concept of nation and a confederation of states from a political standpoint. You are saying that do we say that because it's written in the constitution, or do we say what Chanakya or what our ancient Vedas or shlokas suggested that we were always? Do we look at it from that standpoint? I think that the real test of a democracy at the end of the day, or a polity or a society, is, are you willing to adapt with times? Are you in a position in which you understand that there are certain changes which are happening around you, and are you in a position to critically examine those changes which are happening around you? I think that since our independence, I think that this is the first time over the last decade, I would say, or maybe 2 decades, one could argue, where we are seriously thinking of ourselves and willing to acknowledge ourselves as members of one society, of one homogeneous society. Can there be diversity in homogeneity? Is the other question that I'd like to pose for myself and for you. Maybe we don't have an answer at this stage. Maybe diversity, diverse elements can also come together to constitute and create one idea of a nation. You know, our in India Ahead, the television channel that I'm associated with now and happen to be the stakeholder there, it was a company which was started off by a Telugu print publication called Andhra Prabha. And I want to share with you, Ratanji, that I've had nothing else but deeply enriching academic and social experiences in terms of my engagements with people in the Telugu territory. A lot of people have often asked me when I go to Vijayawada or when I go to Hyderabad, if you ever travel to Andhra Pradesh, you look at the people, you look at the language, you look at the way of life, you could very well argue that you're in a different country. And a lot of people have asked me that, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with these two very conflicting ideas of India, two very conflicting ideas of a nation? The fact that people are now talking about two conflicting ideas of India and not maybe three or four or five conflicting ideas of India is what I was referring to when I say that I think that we are beginning to critically appreciate the pros and cons of being looked at as one country. When I go to Tamil Nadu, if I go to rural parts of Tamil Nadu, many of us journalists we travel to different parts of the country when you're during elections. If you go to Tamil Nadu, unless you know Tamil in rural parts of the country of the state, you will struggle, right? So there is something called the idea of a nation through the idea of language. There is something called the understanding of a nation through the idea of maybe, let's say, economy. There is a gap which exists between the South and the North. There is a gap which exists between the East and the North. In our country, I think what happened was that because North was given such a prominent pole position, largely again due to the Lok Sabha scenario, somewhere the gap which exists between the North and the South, or may I say the East and the North, in these two gaps that we talk about, I think they make it difficult for us to look at ourselves as one country, to look at ourselves as one society, to look at ourselves as one nation. But now is the time when people are realizing that maybe if we were to move beyond all these barriers, maybe there is something else that we can expect. We can look at ourselves completely differently if we were to be in a position to bridge this gap, to bridge this boundary. That's why I argue that since 1947, this is the first time. We may well have existed as a nation in theory, but I think to exist as a nation in principle and in execution, I think those very, very finite steps are being taken, I think, over the last decade or so.
I agree with you, Bhupendra ji, what you state, but on some things I differ. One is that for us Indians, homogeneity is not the answer. See, USA was made by stitching together different states, and they tried to create a new sense of culture, new sense of nationhood from the people who were from very diverse regions. They had no connection with each other. But for me, when I go to Andhra, I don't feel the kind of distance you see, because I see a cultural unity whether I go to Andhra, whether I go to Tamil Nadu, whether I go to Delhi or Northeast. That Hinduness, the Hindu link that everybody across the nation has, unless we identify that Hinduness, we will keep on saying we are very different. There is huge gap between North and South. I believe North and South gap was a typical political creation of the political apparatus, the ruling class of the time, when entire history was written totally with a North-centric view, when the politics was discussed totally North-centric way, and leadership was decided purely on the basis of voting percentage, etc. You remember Kamraj was a national leader, and after that, it simply deteriorated. So our own failure as a political system or political leadership has resulted in the gap you talk about. Why Northeast was different from other parts of the country? Because we believe there was tyranny of distance, because we believe that it is a different part, we have nothing to do with it, and there are different nations, there are different people, and we call them chinks and all. How it has changed after 2014, you know about it, and you already elaborated it. I think unless you touch upon this, the diversity which is expressed differently by the culture, by our own nation, people across India, when we underline that, when Annamalai becomes a hit in Tamil Nadu, how does it become a hit? He carries that typical Hinduness, which Tamil Nadu simply negates. Tamil Nadu, I would say Tamil Nadu politics negates. Because if you go to any part of the Tamil Nadu, you'll find Ram everywhere. There is no Ram. They worship Kartikeya, they don't want to worship Ganpati and Shiva. So this irrationality of political thinking to create vote banks and to create a different personality is at the root of what was happening so far. And if you look at what this government has done, as you rightly pointed out, the liberalization, the cross pollination of ideas, when people from North started working in so-called Madras. I know of my engineer who went to Chennai and is very resentful. He was from North. He said, "What is this dosa? I can't enjoy dosa. ये लोग अक्कल नहीं है. ये लोग चावल, ये रोटी क्यों नहीं खाते हैं? ऐसे भी तुम डोसा क्यों नहीं खाते हो?" They said, "You talk in Tamil." I said, "Why don't you talk in Tamil?" So these ideas, because of the cross section of people migrating everywhere, that is also, like you rightly pointed, liberalization in that sense is very important. When people start recognizing, for us, the entire view of looking at South as Madrasi has changed during last few years, and our view at looking at Northeast or looking at Goa, which we didn't even recognize. For a Madrasi, everyone was a Delhi wala. For Delhi wala, everyone was a Madrasi. This insensitivity that was created has been demolished, as you rightly said, in last few years. So now I would say there are two views. One is that unless we recognize our past linkages and we recognize the diversity, not uniformity, I am totally against homogeneity. But I am saying if we are talking of the diverse elements and the uniform and the underlying unity, we are a nation which has been further strengthened by what Modi has been doing all these years. Otherwise, why would the Bhagwa of UP would appeal to people in Karnataka, for example? Because they are also Bhagwa in that sense. I am not even talking religiosity. I am talking that cultural oneness, which whether a Muslim or whether a Hindu has the same feeling. When a Muslim goes on the stage, he also touches the stage with reverence. It is not just Hindu touches that way. When we go in front of any temple or church and mosque, we automatically fold our hands in prayer because that innate goodness of our people believing that God is everywhere is the strength of this nation. By negating this sense of nationhood and trying to build a new identity only on the basis of growth, economic growth, would not last. Like for an example, USA today, you find suddenly there is huge friction in the society because the imposition of uniformity didn't finally work. So in that way, we are a nation, but what both of us agree is that we are not a confederation of nation anyway, and we are not a union of state. That definition probably came from the total Western reference point when Mr. B.N. Rao created the draft constitution. I think that is where the mistake comes when at the founding of the system itself, we believe that nation will be created by the constitution. Constitution could have created the right ideas when constitution did not talk of ethical values or duties. We were the only constitution, there was no sense of duty. It was not even defined because it took up all the rights from the Western worlds. While we in Southeast Asia, India, we had the sense of duty also, or what we call dharma. That sense of duty was introduced in 1976 by Indira Gandhi ji, though not implemented in spirit, but only talked about. But this difference of our civilization from the others was never appreciated by the makers of the constitution, whatever reason, including Nehru ji didn't understand what Gandhi was saying yesterday in this webinar. I read out a part of the letter that Nehru wrote to Gandhi that her idea don't seem to be gelling with me after 20 years of working with him. So all this confusion yesterday I was talking same thing. We are the only nation who in 70 years of independence were still struggling to find out whether we are a nation or not. That is what Rahul Gandhi started saying. So this is the basic premise that I'm saying, that this confusion is being removed by this current government, which I also pointed out. I'm just going back to civilizational sense, you are going to the modern sense. Both are workable, but I think we need to come clear about our oneness, our diversity, and no need to push people around to create a very uniform state.
You know, Ratanji, I actually let me go one step forward further from what you're saying. I actually today am absolutely convinced now. You know, I mean, 8 years. Narendra Modi became prime minister in 2014. 2014 to 2022, 8 years. If you look at it, I think is a reasonably long length of time for us to come to certain assertions in terms of what's happening to our society and how are we evolving as a democracy. I was, in fact, I was having a conversation with someone senior in the Prime Minister's office just a couple of days back, and I was arguing about Hollywood. somewhere this whole discussion, it went around Kashmir files and what was happening in Kashmir files, and how people were responding to it and how everybody was talking about it. Look, I say that what was missing, and I think that is at the crux of the problem of whether we are a confederation, whether we look at ourselves as a confederation of states, whether we look at ourselves as one nation. This whole argument, which was put up during the Nehruvian era, unity in diversity. It's a remarkably great idea to think about, but how is it actually being implemented on the ground? I think the real root of our confusion stems from our understanding or lack of unity in diversity. Is unity in diversity possible? Is unity in diversity not possible? Is it possible for us to talk about one faith, one value system? And I look at Hollywood. I look at cinema as a great educational experience, and I would suggest to many of the youngsters who are joining here to look at different forms of world cinema. If you look at Hollywood, you will always, without fail, you look at a James Bond movie, you look at a Tom Hanks movie, you look at a Bruce Willis movie, you look at any big budget, big star cast movie in Hollywood, there is always one value system which is spoken about. And that value system is the American value system. That American value system which triumphs over everything against all odds. What do you say, Ratanji, that if you go, if you're driving and you suddenly come across a Sai Baba mutt or a temple or a mosque, what do we usually do? We just fold our hands. Even when you drive, you may not stop, but you just do a simple cross. You see a dead body, which is crossing a procession, which is crossing you. You immediately fold your hands and you offer a silent prayer for the peace of the soul. Those are things, I think, which were there in our subconscious, but those things were not coming together. That idea of a value, I think the concept of a nation stems from the concept of value. How do we define that value?
Totally agree.
How do we define the concept of life through a value system? Do we define it through religiosity? Do we define it through a certain, let's say, a principal pole of faith? And that's why when I look at Hollywood, in times of adversity, or you look at a movie called The Hunt for Red October, or look at a movie called the Bridge of Spies, you will see in times of great conflict there is a certain greatness of the American value system which comes across to the viewer. Then when you're in trouble, you get inspired by that value system. So when I say that you take you back to what I was arguing, when I say that in the last decade, I think that people have started to understand this value system. And therefore, this journey of us being looked at as one nation, I think, has begun firmly. Are we a Hindu nation? Are we a nation which is being guided by one faith, one religion, one value system? I think is a work in progress. And somewhere I think that we will come to some conclusion, I think, in the days to come, in the years to come, Ratanji.
Thanks, Bhupendraji. Though we never talk about one religion, we talk about one culture where every religion has a huge space. There is no intolerance for any religion as a belief system. That is typical Indian value. Unfortunately, as rightly pointed out, our Bollywood, our Hollywood, or our own cinema, especially Mumbai cinema, I'm not talking regional cinema, they are much more rooted in the culture, has tried to create a very horrible hodgepodge ideas with American ideas, with some British ideas, with some weird Western ideas which have no link to our culture, no value system. Till 70s, we had movies which had certain value system which was typical Indian, whether it's done by a leftist communist writer or a typical Desi Punjabi man. There were inherent values which are present. Now they are all gone. We are simply copy pasting whatever Western or Hollywood movies make, minus the value system. We look at ourselves in a very ridiculous way. We have typical, I would say, self-loathing that we have created through the movies. And you rightly pointed out that is also changing. I think the Kashmir Files in that way is a beginning, though there are a lot of good movies made earlier also, keeping in mind Indian sensibilities. The success of Telugu cinema and Tamil cinema in North with dubbing is a living proof that people want to live with their roots firmly in the place. With this, your wonderful idea about how we are evolving as a nation despite whatever happened in last 70 years, I'll open the floor for questions. It's a very provocative subject, and especially youth who are still who have not seen like us the earlier part of the independence struggle. They have not seen the wonderful leaders of those times who are deeply rooted in Indian values. So for them, it's a very interesting topic. I think we should open the floor for the questions.
Sure, sure, sure.
Yes, Devendra. Devendra, you can open the floor.
Devin? Okay, I'll take the questions then.
Yeah, I have not seen any questions so far, so I open the floor now.
You can ask.
You can raise a question to Mr.
You may ask the questions.
Satish is making a beginning, I think. Dr. Satish Mood.
Yeah, very good morning. This debate about the nationhood, why it has become relevant suddenly now? This is my, of course, I am the director of the institution where this literature festival is happening. But when we were discussing about various topics, why this debate has become so important for us? Even today, this RRR movie is released, and which is based on, the freedom fight. We never heard of those characters earlier. They were never taught to us in our schools that such freedom fighting took place there. And now we have such a big movie based on those two characters. So in light of that, I would like to know why this discussion has become so important about our nationhood and our independence again.
Is that question to me or Ratan?
Yes, to you.
All questions to you.
Okay. Let me give you an example of where I am right now in Lucknow. I have been in this business now for well over 20 years now. The word Rashtravad, the word nationalism, the extent to which Rashtravad and nationalism has started to get used since 2014, we'd never seen that happening earlier. If let's say pre 2014, if you were to look at pre Modi era and post Modi era, pre Modi era was all about Garibi Hatao, was all about who's Garibi, and and was the real buzzword. What Modi has done is that in order to deal with Garibi, he speaks about Vikas, and in order to deal with that Vikas, he speaks about Rashtravad. A few days back, you're saying that you were talking about this, Satish, that how you there are so many new ideas which are now being spoken about. If I was to ask your students if people have heard of Birsa Munda, there is a lot of work which has been done around Birsa Munda. Did we know about it? Right. It is now because there is there are various bodies which are associated with it. I think what has happened, and we must acknowledge it, what has happened is that Modi has given us a new idea to ponder over. That new idea is the idea of a new nation. And the idea of a new nation stems from a very different thought process and a different concept which the Congress is steeped in our DNA. So it will play itself out in academic syllabuses, it will play itself out on platforms like these, and it is becoming politically salient. There are a lot of people. Let me, maybe this will make your students appreciate this more. Someone shared a very good anecdotal experience with me when I was traveling across UP during the elections. Someone pointed out that an Akhilesh Yadav went with a mirror before a poor person, and a Yogi Adityanath went with a mirror before the same poor person. When Akhilesh Yadav went with that mirror before that poor person saw the poverty and all kinds of problems, his life in full picture. But when Yogi Adityanath showed that mirror to the same poor person, that person sees Narendra Modi in him. When he sees Narendra Modi, he forgets about everything. He forgets what his reality is. He forgets what his what are his daily challenges, his daily dilemmas. I think that is what, and somewhere Ratanji and I have referred to it, that if we push the idea of nation, if we seep the idea of nation through the idea of faith, and that idea of faith leads us to an understanding of our nation, I think that is what is on the table today. People are beginning to acknowledge it. People are beginning to accept it. As a psephologist and a political analyst, I can give you various arguments. If you ask me why has the BJP won the state of UP, I will give you 10 kinds of theories. But the reality is that from 2014 till 2021 to 22, and as long as Narendra Modi was the Gujarat chief minister, the number of so-called floating voters, the number of so-called undecided voters, always swung towards the BJP in majority. If there were 100 undecided voters, 51 would go for the BJP. The reason why 51 would go for the BJP, whether it was Gujarat during his chief ministerial years or now, is, I think, the process of understanding of this idea of nation. From 2002 to 2014, every Gujarat Assembly election, you would hear about Patels being angry with the BJP. You would hear Saurashtra, which is dominated by Patels, always angry with the BJP. And when it would come to the elections, it would always be Patels who would be voting for the BJP. So the reason why we're talking about the nation is because we are beginning to understand, we're beginning to critically appreciate the nuances, the pros, the cons. What is it that we can really be if we were to look at ourselves as one nation and not as a confederation of states? I think is a thought, an idea, which has now become a subject in our subconscious. And I think it's from our subconscious, it's coming forward, it's being put on the table, and because it's being put on the table, therefore it ends up becoming a part of discussions in rooms like these.
Even though I have some follow-up questions, but I will wait for my students to ask, and if nobody is asking, then I will ask my follow-up question.
Sure, by all means.
But very
There are two
perceptive
questions.
observation, I would say. Bhupendra, this was very perceptive observation.
Yeah, anyone else?
There are two questions there. Ratanji, you can take them. They're on the chat box.
Oh, I'm not seeing
Devin,
the chat.
can you read them?
In the chat
Oh, yeah,
box,
I'll
there-
read. So the first question is by Mansi Jain.
Yeah, Mansi Jan says, how do you handle a hostile or uncooperative interview?
Well, Mansi, okay. I must acknowledge this. I don't look at myself as someone who's. I look at myself as someone who's contributing his own 2 bits in the setting up of the idea of a nation. But I don't look at myself necessarily as someone who's running the nation. That's not my brief. I know many of my contemporaries, many of my peers would like to believe that. So when there is an uncooperative interview, or let's say if someone is getting angry with me, and it has happened on multiple occasions with me, I can share an experience with you all, since there are all students here. Many years back, if I remember correctly, it was 2005 or 2006. The BJP was in opposition. L.K. Advani was at the peak of his political prowess. He, I think, was the BJP president. There was a national executive meeting of the BJP, which was being held in Ranchi. And we were there, and I was doing my live broadcasting. There was some big issue which was being spoken about, and I suddenly saw Murli Manohar Joshi, who at that time was also a fountainhead of the BJP. I saw him. In my great excitement, I held him by his arm. I just touched him. Because I wanted to put my mic in front of him. He got very, very annoyed with me. He got very angry with me. And he said, what a mannerless person you are. He said, what a rude person you are. He said everything on live television. That how dare you touch me? How dare you hold my hand? Right? He said all that. I just apologized to him. I didn't argue with him. I apologized. I said, I'm really sorry, sir, if you felt bad. My idea was just to put a question, but if you felt bad, I feel bad. I feel sorry. But you know what happened? Because I didn't argue with him and I said sorry to him. Next morning, he called me and said, "Tum kahan ho?" I said, "Sir, I'm here only." He said, "You come and have breakfast with me." He invited me over. And, we became great friends thereafter. Advani ji himself got very annoyed with me. In course of an interview, I asked him, I think the BJP was just voted out of power. This was 2005. And I asked him a question about his desire of becoming the prime minister. And in course of a long answer that he gave me, he gave one line where he said that I mean, his reference was something else, but he ended up saying that I don't need Atal Bihari Vajpayee to become the Prime Minister. Now, that one line was picked up by the Hindi press, by Jagran and Bhaskar and all, and it became a big talking point. That Advani says that I don't need Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He got very annoyed with me. I went to him. I told him. I said, but that's not what you were saying, and that's not what I asked you. But I can't help it if public discourse, changes around this. He said, I'm boycotting you. Venkaiah Naidu ji, if I remember, was, he was, I think, the key spokesperson. He publicly declared me to be someone who had issued a fake press release and whatnot. All kinds of things happened. But, people forget about it. In course of a live interview, I think the principle that I always follow, Ratanji and I have many disagreements. So like we started off on on two contradictory poles. But I always look at an argument as an argument where some kind of a constructive consensus needs to be created. My idea is not to put the other person down. You end up being in a problem if your basic construct is that I have to put the other person down. If I have to throw the other person, out of the studio, that's not the way I practice my craft. My idea is to look for consensus. My idea is to look for constructive solutions. Ratanji, any other question that you're seeing?
There's one more.
Yeah.
By Devashish Panchal.
The second question is by Devashish Panchal. He asks, despite the manifold cultural diversity, what are some of the common threads across the length and breadth of India?
Well, I think we've touched upon that. I think the common thread, the biggest common thread today, which can be seen across the length and breadth of India, is faith. Earlier, it's not as if that we've suddenly discovered our faith, but I think that we've rediscovered our faith. I think that we are very comfortable with the thought that our faith can drive us. Someone very close to me, I'll share this experience with you. Someone very close to me is in the process of building a house. While building that house, and I don't intend to preach any astrology or any supernatural belief here. The person asked me if I knew any Vastu consultant. Now, the person who was speaking to me is a great liberal, is a very well-heeled individual. So I did not expect that individual to ask me a question about Vastu. I said, I didn't know that you were a believer of Vastu. So that entity said, no, it's not as if that I'm a believer of Vastu, but you know what? I'm beginning to question myself. I'm beginning to challenge myself. So I want to be very clear that whatever I'm doing, I'm on the right trajectory. So if you can help me with that. I think the common thread, which is becoming very, very common, is that we are a nation which will ultimately be determined by its faith. Now, Ratanji will counter me and say that we've always been a nation which has been determined by its faith. We may have been determined by faith in theory, but I think in execution, in practical terms, I think those very firm and concrete steps are being taken by us today as a country. That's the biggest common factor that I see unfolding across the length and breadth of India.
I think we can conclude the session. Ratanji, I'll request you for your final remarks.
There is a last question. If Bhupendra has time, we can take one question and close it then.
Sure.
Anjum Inamdar, that is the last question.
What is the question? Ratanji, can you give me the question?
Sir, you mentioned about the value system. We want to know how can we add value and contribute to the society as future leaders.
That's an important question, and to all people who are in their mid-20s, to those of you who follow the stock markets, let me explain to you. When the Zomato IPO came up, the Zomato IPO was one of the biggest IPOs that came in the history of stock markets. Here is a company which had no profitability around it. It had no profitability over the next 10 years, but yet it was promising enormous value to its shareholders. 70% of people who invested in that potential idea of value in that Zomato stock were people who were under the age of 25. 70%. Which means that you don't need to be someone who's in his 30s and 40s, and you don't need to be a Manis and Adanis to move the markets. Now, it's a different thing that stock may well have, it may well settle down at different values subsequently. But the way for individuals like people today to contribute to to the idea of nation building is to determine a certain value for your own self. Are you a person who's being guided by faith? Are you a person who's willing to take a hit if it helps your country? We're all very selfish people. Let me be clear. वो जो voter जो vote देता है वो कहता है अच्छा you've given me 2,000 rupees today. What are you going to give me tomorrow? Only then I'll give you a vote. Which is why you see the electoral cycle unfolding itself in various ways. If you contribute to the creation of a society which is well read, if you contribute to the creation of a society which is well educated, if you contribute to the creation of a society which contributes to creating constructive solutions, I think that value-based system is what you're looking for, which will help democracy, which will help the country. And if your democracy gets strengthened, if your country gets strengthened, you will ultimately end up strengthening yourself as well. Why do you think, again, to borrow a line from Hollywood, why do you think that this, the land of dreams, the big apple, where did these ideas come from? A society came together at various stages. I think we are at that stage. We also need to have an idea of our own. And I think that people today, youngsters like yourselves, are the best people, best poised to do this.
I think this is a wonderful positive note to close on. It was a wonderful question, and Bhupendra ji gave a wonderful answer. Thank you so much, Bhupendra ji. And I think the last question put everything in place. And I think this is what the youth wanted to know. And with this, I thank you very much. And we close the session, Devendra.
Thank
We
you,
have a
Ratan
book
ji.
from
Yeah. Bhupendra ji, thank you once again for accepting our request and coming down for this dialogue.
Sure.
You kept the conversation interesting, especially by sharing those interesting anecdotes, whether it was from your experience in Andhra or whether the anecdote which you shared about LK Advaniji's interview which you took. So it was very benefiting for our audience, especially the students coming from a experience of a rich journalist as you. Also, the last point which you made, rediscovering the faith. I think that also summed up the entire discussion. Ratanji, we don't need to thank you as you are a part of our family. We would now head towards the virtual launch of Ratanji's latest book, Conflict Resolution the RSS Way. Would once again invite Ratanji to speak a few words about his new book.
When I spoke about the book yesterday, so I would not like to speak much. Yesterday there was a book release in Delhi, which was a great success. Bhupendra ji, I think, got stuck in Lucknow.
Yeah, I was really keen.
Yes.
I was really keen to come and attend that because,
Yes.
But I got stuck here.
Yeah, I would just say that this book basically tries to take the discussion away from RSS usual image as a Hindu nationalist organization or a militant organization or some organization which cannot go beyond Hindutva. And I look at RSS role in mitigating the conflicts that arise in any nation that were there in India since 1947 with prior history to it. And then I try to see how RSS looks at those issues. I try to highlight the RSS policy statements basically come from resolutions and how resolutions are created and how they are then put into practice, and whether RSS worldview is different from others at that time, what other leaders and people of the time thought. So it is not a unidimensional view of RSS only, but RSS view of the issues in the society, the issues which are looked upon by other mainstream intellectuals or political leaders. And when a resolution is passed, how RSS puts it into practice on the ground, and how it strategizes for different regions in a different way, depending on the region, depending on the problem, and also depending on its own strength. And how finally, if we see issues have been brought down to a level where they are manageable and some of them are solved. So I will not talk much about it because yesterday we talked about it. And with this, I thank you very much for talking about the book again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratanji. I once again thank everyone for joining in the first session for this day. We will be having our next session shortly in the next 15 minutes. We'll logged on. So, and once again, I would request everyone to
Thank you.
Thank you, Bhupendra.
Thank you.
As the book launch is being done during the literature festival, I would request Swati Singh to buy 3 copies of the book and keep it
Yes.
in our library for reference to our students.
Yes.
Thanks, Satish.
Thank you so much.
So, Bhupendra, see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Namaskar. Soon you may log in and we'll continue with the next session at 10:45.